Typography is as much about shaping the space between and around letters, words, and blocks of text as it is about shaping the type itself. In typography, there are terms for different kinds of spaces, and there are principles that govern how these spaces should relate to one another. So let's take a closer look at typographic space. The spacing of letters relative to one another in a typeface is called letter spacing. Type designers program letter spacing directly into a font's file. They make the spacing balance between the letters and within other letters. Adding or subtracting space between letters in a word, sentences, or paragraphs in typesetting is called tracking. If you're setting type at a small size, 9 points or below, adding a little bit of tracking, say 10 to 20 units, can help make the letters be more clearly legible. But at large sizes, too much tracking can make a word start to visually disintegrate because the letters aren't close enough for one another to stick together as a single word. In fact, if you're setting a large title, you may want to set negative tracking. This will bring the letters even closer together than their native letter spacing. One place for extra tracking that's always appropriate is in setting uppercase type. Because uppercase letters usually appear next to lowercase letters, they're designed for the tighter spacing of lowercase letters. So when you set them with one another, you need to be able to add tracking to a good 20 to 50 units. Adjusting spacing between two particular letters, regardless of their overall tracking, is called kerning. Kerning is sometimes necessary when you have two letters that fit together awkwardly. In this word, because of the shapes of the uppercase A and V, there's some distracting extra space between those two letters, so we'll kern them closer together. Typefaces these days are pre-programmed with kerning for problematic letter combinations, so manual kerning is rarely necessary. The space between one baseline and the next is called the leading. The name comes from the strips of lead that used to be placed between lines of type in letterpress printing. A particular setting of type is described in combination of type size and leading. A common setting for text in books, for instance, is 9-point type with 12 points of leading. This is described in typesetting as 9/12, and it's written like this. There's no easy rule to determine the proper leading, but the principle is to set the lines of type far enough away from each other so that the eye can clearly distinguish between them, but still close enough together that we can see the paragraph of type as a single block, and not to connect or disconnect any floating lines. In this typesetting, there's too little leading. It's hard for our eyes to follow along a line without getting too confused with the one that's above. And in this paragraph, there's probably too much leading. The lines are really distinct from one another, but the paragraph is no longer holding together as a visual cohesive chunk. The X height of typefaces you're setting affects the leading because typefaces with a big X height look visually larger than typefaces with a small X height, but they need more leading. Here, both typefaces are set 9/12, but the typeface on the right with the smaller X height feels like it has more leading. Another factor in the matrix of special relationships is the line length. Line length is measured by the average number of letters that fit in a line of text. A good line length is long enough that your eye doesn't have to start a new line every few words, but short enough that when you come to the end of one line, you're close enough to the start of the next to be able to find it easily. 66 characters per line is often seen as that sweet spot for line length. But up to 80 characters still works, and down to 40 characters for a narrow column of works of text also works. So how does line length affect leading? Well, if your lines are longer, you may need to have more spacing between them in order for the reader's eye to follow along. A final variable is the text alignment. When text is aligned to the left side and not the right, it's referred to as left align. The advantage of setting type this way is that it allows typeface's native letter spacing and word spacing to be preserved unaltered. The disadvantage is that it creates an uneven edge along one side of the text. This is called a rag. And in future video, we'll look at how the rag can be manipulated to a more visually pleasing standard. An alternative is to set alignment text as justified text, text that has both the left and right sides aligned. The advantage of setting this type is that it creates an edge on both sides. But the disadvantage is that the word spacing and/or tracking have to be altered in order to make the longer lines shorter and shorter lines longer. And this breaks up the text and the lines in the text, creating some vertical channels throughout the paragraph that has to be compensated for by increasing the leading. And so you can see the variables that define typographic spacing, tracking, leading, line length, alignment, they all affect one another. So as a typographer, it's important to be really aware of all these special relationships within the working of your type.